الزميلات والزملاء الأعزاء، الحضور الكريم، مرحبا بكم وبمن يتابعنا عبر وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي في حلقة نقاشية جديدة من برنامج سيمينار المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات، الذي يستضيف باحثي المركز وأساتذة معهد الدوحة للدراسات العليا وسائر الباحثين المهتمين من الخارج لمناقشة مشاريع بحثية تهم المنطقة العربية. يسر المركز العربي ضيف اليوم الزميلة الأستاذة حميدة درزادeh في عرض ستقدمه عن الحالة المؤقتة الطويلة الأمد والحياة العابرة للحدود للمجتمع البلوشي. وللتعقيب على عرضها يستضيف المركز أيضا الزميل الدكتور مهران كمرافا. حميدة دورزادeh باحثة مساعدة ومنسقة وحدة الدراسات الإيرانية في المركز العربي. قبل انضمامها إلى المركز عملت مترجمة ومساعدة بحثية لمشروع الأخلاقيات الحيوية الإسلامية في جامعة جورج تاون قطر، كما عملت مستشارة لمشروع رباعيات في متحف قطر، حيث أجرت بحوثا حول التركيبة السكانية والتطورات الاجتماعية والتاريخية والبيئة الاقتصادية في دولة قطر، وهي حاصلة على الماجستير في تخصص المرأة والمجتمع والتنمية من جامعة حمد بن خليفة في سنة 2021، وحاصلة أيضا على بكالوريوس في الاقتصاد الدولي من جامعة جورج تاون قطر في سنة 2018. ستقدم الأستاذة دورزادeh عرض اليوم باللغة الإنجليزية، وسيكون تعقيب الدكتور كمرافا أيضا باللغة الإنجليزية، وسنستقبل بعد ذلك أسئلة باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية. أهلا وسهلا بك، تفضلي لك الكلمة.
شكرا عايشة البصري for the kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I would also like to thank Dr. Kamrava for being here, as well as the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for providing me with the opportunity to present my research, as well as my colleagues at the Arab Center, mainly Dr. Ayat Hamdan and Hamideh Dorzadeh for their support and for believing in me. So this work has been part of my master's thesis at Hamad bin Khalifa University's Women's Society and Development. And it's important to highlight that my research journey on the Baluch community began as a personal endeavor. And as a response to the many stereotypes about the community and lack of knowledge, my aim became to address these misconceptions and center my work on the lives of those who do not often get to be at the center. This by no means is an attempt to essentialize the lives of the Baluch or try to homogenize their experiences or to speak on their behalf or represent them. My work seeks to contribute to the literature on Qatari society and the rapid developments of the last 20 years, with its diverse people who have witnessed and experienced such momentous change firsthand. So the seminar will explore the relationship between temporariness and transnationalism in the context of Baluch in Qatar. While my focus is on the Baluch community in Qatar and their history beginning in late 1960s and early 1970s until present moment, I just want to briefly talk about the literature that exists on the Baluch in the Gulf region. Here, I'm not trying to talk about the history and the presence of the Baluch in this region, because I think it's a difficult task to do, given much of the contradictions that exist within the literature and lack of sources with precise data. I also acknowledge that the conditions of Baluch in each of these countries differs based on the size of the community and their impact. And to be frank with you, there's still so much to be written about the Baluch despite their considerable presence in the region. The available literature focuses on Oman for an obvious reasons, due to the existence of a larger Baluch population in comparison to other GCC countries. Such literature traces Baluch migration, traces Baluch presence in Oman, the Gulf by extension, back to 16th and 17th centuries. based on accounts of European travelers. Sometimes they vaguely claim that the Baluch existence in the region dates back to innumerable centuries. When exactly, only God knows. So this history of the Baluch in the region is like a broken track record, with each scholar, including those who just started writing about the Baluch, repeating the same narrative of their migration to the region without questioning it or analytically engaging with it. Factors behind Baluch migration, as mentioned in the literature, in different periods are broad and in some cases not context specific. For instance, Peterson provides three factors, the first being, as he states in his own words, quote, the general tendency for ethnic or sectarian communities to spread into neighboring lands, end of quote. The second factor is the martial reputation of Baluch and Baluch serving as soldiers throughout the Gulf, in particular Oman. The third factor connects the Baluch migration to a general migration of labor during the oil period. Much of this literature discusses the Baluch migration, as I said, at the macro level. Most importantly, gender is overlooked, leading to the homogenization of the experiences of the Baluch. Women are completely absent from this history that mainly focuses on the male migrant. In fact, economic and military explanatory factors of Baluch migration are prevalent in the limited scholarly works on Baluch, and they do not go beyond this narrative. And the literature also reinforces existing stereotypes against the Baluch. Oftentimes, the Baluch are described as soldiers, as mentioned. Many Baluch scholars have criticized this literature, proposing, as Ahmad Yaqub al-Mazmi does, quote, desoldiering Baluch history in the Arabian Peninsula. I generally think that this literature is also frozen in time and almost fixed and does not take into account the diversity of narratives and barely explains how the Baluch migration to the region changed over time. As we can see, the focus of the literature is on the history, but what about now and contemporary conditions of the Baluch in the Gulf? This is where my study, I think, makes a very important contribution. So in terms of my methodology, my study is a qualitative research, given, as I said, the absence of previous research and written source material on the Baluch community. I rely on data collected through semi-structured oral history and ethnographic interviews. My interviewees, men and women, are residents of Qatar with Iranian citizenship between ages 21 and 67. Some migrated from Iran to Qatar in late 1960s and beginning of 1970s, the period in which Qatar became an independent state in 1971, while others were born and raised in Qatar. They live in Farij al-Baluch, or Baluch compound, with low socioeconomic status. And I will discuss the Baluch compound as my field site as I show some pictures of this site. In terms of educational background, most of my interviewees have not attained a high school degree. And interviews were conducted in the local language, meaning Baluchi language. So my field site, I just want to show pictures. So I'll share screen now. So Farij al-Baluch, as even indicated in this map, or as it's also commonly known among the community as Farij al-Baluch, so it's located in the district of Abu Hamur. It's a site of my fieldwork and I grew up. It is a very lively and busy place with cars hemming it in right and left. And this picture here shows an aerial image of the space itself. As you can see, it's a very vast area. And the compound has only one entrance. And this is, as I said, the only entrance to this space. And there are also commercial buildings around the space, sort of hiding this area. And the first thing that you see when you enter this compound is supermarket Jawahir. So other than these small shops, there are also mosques located around the building. So as I said, so there are cars around the building and the houses are built to each other, and one can literally hear the neighbor's noise. So each of them, they look different in color and size. And the residents of the compound were awarded land and permission to build their houses in 1980s by Wazarat al-Baladiyya, or the Ministry of Municipality and Environment. Baluch previously lived in Firij Abdulaziz and Nuaija. Both districts are located in the municipality of Doha. This was around the time that Qatar was becoming increasingly urbanized in the late 1980s and beginning of 1990s. Residents were provided with a contract known as Acknowledgement and Pledge Form, or as the title of the document says, Namudaj Iqrar wa Ta'ahud, when they received the land. So according to this contract, the lands given to the residents in this compound are temporary. To assist the families, the Baladiyya provided them with free building materials for house construction and asked them to build their houses according to the specifications provided by the authorities without modifying them in future. If the Baladiyya requests the residents to evacuate their homes, the contract states that they will have no right to object nor claim ownership of the land or the house. According to the contract, authorities are not provide them with an alternative space to reside or monetary compensation. However, in 2016, the Department of State Properties at the Baladiyya issued a decision to remove the Baluch compound and relocate all the residents to a new location to provide them with better housing. So discussions about relocating families appear every now and then. But until now, nothing yet has happened. And as you can see, the compound has stayed in place. So when looking at the composition of the compound, the space is divided between Baluch, Brahuis, who are another ethnic group that has its own language, but they oftentimes identify themselves as Baluch due to the shared histories and geographic location. A third group is Joskis, referring to Bandar-e-Josk, a city located in Hormozgan province in Iran. As you can see, this map illustrates the spatial divide. So Baluch reside in areas shaded as black, Joskis reside in areas shaded as yellow, while Brahuis are living towards the end of the compound, which is shaded in green. And other than Baluch, Joskis, and Brahuis, many low-income male workers from different nationalities who are known among the community members as Uzubi or Huzubi in Baluchi, single men, reside in the compound. This area, as I have shown here, is shown in red. So most people live in extended families, as this picture illustrates, which is evident also from the structure and the houses built, either enlarged through expanding into empty spaces available in front of their houses, or building additional apartments on rooftops to accommodate additional family members. High rent prices in Doha have also been a decisive factor in pushing residents to live in extended families. It is not unusual to find 3 or more married sons living in their parents' house, along with their single sisters who are treated as guests given in the house. So moving on to the theory, my theoretical framework deals with the notion of transnationalism. Transnationalism is defined as the process through which migrants build social fields between quote-unquote host country, quote-unquote country of origin. These social fields are defined by Levitt and Sichler as networks of social relations, quote, through which ideas, practices, and resources are unequally exchanged, organized, and transformed, end of quote. According to them, these social fields are established by those, quote-unquote, migrated and those, quote-unquote, stay in place. This binary of host and home countries, so host country, country of origin, within the literature on transnationalism, belittles the diverse networks held by Baluch across border. While here in this presentation and also in my work, I pay attention to the transnational activities of Baluch between Iran and Qatar. Baluch have relatives in other countries, such as the UAE and Oman, with whom they also have transnational connection. So I focus on transnationalism from below. That centers around less institutionalized form of grassroots initiatives by immigrants and their quote-unquote home country counterparts. In my case, transnationalism from below involves the activities of Baluch and their keen members, rather than state-led institutions and organizations. So transnationalism from below denounces power relations and focuses on the agency of the migrant. Engaging in transnational activities enables Baluch residents of Qatar to challenge their status quo as merely temporary migrants with a precarious legal condition and create an alternative reality in which they have more stability and permanency. However, this does not mean that the state and its policies do not play a role in influencing the transnational ties and social fields accessed by migrants across borders. I explain transnationalism from below in the context of reactive transnationalism. Some scholars refer to the term reactive transnationalism in relation to Latin American migrants in the US and define it as transnational practices that are a result of negative experiences of immigrants in the quote-unquote host country, including discrimination or a negative perception of the receiving society that leads them to retain an identification with their quote-unquote country of origin. So these spontaneous transnational activities could be a combination, as scholars within this literature say, a combination of socio-cultural and economic activities. But I think, in my opinion, gender needs to be considered to better understand transnationalism, as men and women participate differently in transnational social spaces, and transnational engagement and participation in my case study is highly gendered. Gender differences in the experiences and practices of transnationalism within an intersectional approach can reveal how gender, class, immigrant status impact transnational activities. So now I move to the third part of this presentation. So here I want to highlight some of the findings from this research and also explain the living condition of the Baluch in Qatar at the moment. So just to provide you with more context on the Baluch in Qatar, I would like to shed light on the narrative of Baluch migration to Qatar, as told by my older generation migrants who took this journey. So my interviewees were very young at the time of their arrival in Doha, as their memories of the journey from Baluchistan to Qatar are not very detailed, but three key elements stand out in their narratives. These include economic and socio-political motives of migration, lack of official documents, these include passports and identity documents to enter Qatar, and group solidarity and chain migration. So just to also talk about some of these narratives. So Abdul is a 67-year-old Baluch resident who migrated to Qatar from Baluchistan, Iran, in 1967. So at the time of his migration, he was only 13 years old. He noted that it was very common for the Baluch to travel around the region, and particularly to Qatar, given that they have a long history of migration in the Arabian Peninsula. In Abdul's words, everyone came to Qatar, so I came. Another quote by Abdul: "We came with the boat through the sea. We came to the Qatari port, and there was no other port. There was only one police station. We went down from the boat and directly came to the city." As Abdul saw, Qatar was still going through urban and economic development, including construction of infrastructure and government buildings. He had to travel through Dubai to get to Qatar from Baluchistan. And I want to show this route here. So they took this journey from Qatar port. And it's a port oftentimes mentioned by some of my interviewees. So they traveled from Qatar and then by boat reaching to Dubai. And then from Dubai, they reached to Qatar. So this was the route that was taken by most Baluch I interviewed. So Abdul considered the economic possibilities offered in Qatar in comparison to Balochistan as a factor to migrate, quote. He says, there was life in Qatar. Makaron, Balochistan, as referred among the Baluch, had nothing. So in Makaron, there were dates, trees, lands, and that's all. In Qatar, there are dukans, meaning shops. There are goods, you could work and have money in your pocket and buy things. So life was better in Qatar than Makaron. So Qatar looked different from the life that Abdul had in Balochistan, which was mainly based on agriculture and farming. However, an important addition of my research is basically centering the narrative of the Baluch also on the lives of women. So stories of women migrants offer additional insights into the migration journey of Baluch in Qatar. So Khatoon was 3 months old and Guluk 7 years when their mother migrated to Qatar to the same route that Abdul took. So Balochistan to Dubai and Dubai to Qatar. They stayed in Dubai for a short period of time before leaving for Qatar. Guluk recalls that, quote, in Dubai, they said that there would be a country called Qatar. And we figured out that Qatar was better and we stayed here in Qatar. Her fascinating account shows that even among ordinary people, the nation-building processes in Qatar were known and talked about, and people looked at the country to be as a future destination for work and more prosperous lives. Her sister also said that her mother struggled a lot with Hakuma, local ruling elites, and lost her. So Balochistan, as we know, around the time that they came, they were living in a very tribal society. There were significant power relations that existed. So this socio-political factor also had economic implications. Khatoon's mother lost her husband, the only financial provider of the household. So forms of control and regulation of movement were beginning to be implemented during this period in Qatar. But the stories of my interviewees show that they could get around these new regulations, which were not as rigid as they are today. However, my women interviewees emphasized in their narrative that they were smuggled into Qatar. One of them said, quote, "We were smuggled and a nakhuda, captain of the boat, carried us across the sea to Qatar. We didn't have any documentation then. We didn't have shinasname, which is an identity document issued in Iran, because back then it was done through smuggling." End of quote. This obviously had to do with the fact that around this time it was more common for men, usually single and young, to migrate. Abdul also noted that he knew women who used to hide in the enclosed spaces within a boat. And when Abdul came to Qatar, he was only occupied by men with no women on board. All said that there was a possibility for women to be stopped and subject to questions by authorities. So aimed the existence of all these regulations, Baluch women's migration to Qatar was facilitated by community solidarity. Guluk, when recalling her journey to Qatar, said, "We did not have anyone with us, but there were Hamahalis with us." Hamahali meaning people from Balochistan. So women said people traveled together and stopped and supported each other in the boats despite not knowing one another. The support was not only from family, as I said, but also from other Baluch. One important thing that I want to highlight here is that the stories of Baluch migrants are, of course, not separate from Qatar's history. And in my study, I have historicized this period, basically looking at the period of Qatar's independence and state formation to examine political, economic, and social transformations in terms of demographics in the country in the 1960s and 70s, as well as the emergence of laws pertaining to residency, citizenship, and nationality, which basically defined who's who. Despite living in Qatar since then, all my interviewees do not possess Qatari citizenship. and instead their legal status is defined by the kafala or sponsorship system. So residents' legal status and their ability to remain in the country being dependent on the kafala system is a source of temporariness, insecurity, and uncertainty for most Baluch. Guluk stated that, quote, "Now that we are old and they," she refers to they as employers, "expelled us from work, the government can kick us out because it's not our mulk." The Baluch term mulk was used repeatedly by my interviewees. Other than its literal translation as country, mulk implies a sense of ownership from the Arabic term al-mulk. The sense of ownership is not only directed towards Iran as a country, but also to Baluchistan. My interviewees barely refer to Qatar as mulk, and they only used it in its literal definition. So resident status is dependent, as I said, on employment contracts, and they can only renew their residency permits for up to 3 years. This means that in principle, they can plan ahead not more than 3 years. So it's temporary but also permanent, whereby they have lived in the country for generations but still feel insecure about their legal status. So one of the ways through which the Baluch, especially those who have retired, have been able to continue living in the country for generations is through the sponsorship of younger family members. Those who sponsor are mostly young men who are trusted by the principal head of the household, the father, and are considered to inherit the position of household head in the absence of the father. While the law in principle allows employed women to sponsor their male relatives, the gendered patterns of sponsorship that exist within the Baluch community makes it unlikely for women to assume the position of kafil or sponsor. Neha Vora, writing on the Indian community in the UAE, refers to this feeling or state as permanent temporariness, whereas ethnography deals with the lived experiences of the Indian community, who, similar to the Baluch, are long-standing residents and have lived in the UAE for generations. Indians, however, are not interested in formally belonging to Dubai through citizenship, and instead consider India their home. However, this is not the case in the Baluch context. So despite the temporary nature of their legal status, all my interviewees expressed belonging to Qatar and also an interest in obtaining Qatari citizenship because of their contribution to the country and long residence. Another recent study on middle-class Pakistani migrants in Dubai also tackles experiences of migration, temporariness, and belonging. So this study suggests that temporariness does not disencourage Pakistanis from constructing a sense of belonging to Dubai, which is exactly the case of the Baluch. However, their insecure status pushes them to consider forward planning and exit strategies through engagement in transnational networks. So while the feeling of temporariness is shared by both Pakistanis in Dubai and Baluch in Qatar, a significant difference is that my participants come from a low socioeconomic status, which impacts the opportunities available to them, including their transnational activities. So unlike middle-class Pakistanis in Dubai, the Baluch in Qatar have few exit options and even fewer opportunities for upward mobility. So one of the important ways that the Baluch deal with their sense of temporariness is through building houses in Iran, even if they do not have an intention to return permanently. And here I will provide the example of one of my interviewees who owns 3 houses. His name is Noor Mohammad, and he also has a land and is financially well off in Qatar. He stated that he has been to Iran 12 times, and during his visit, he witnessed people's struggles and harsh economic and living conditions in Baluchistan. So this worry of where to stay when heading back to Iran for family visits, and most importantly, when returning to Iran, in case their residency is not renewed, was mentioned many times by my Baluch interviewees. So Zainab, another one of my interviewees, she acknowledged that her family only recently started talking about having houses in Iran. So in her own word, quote, "One is staying in a Khaliji Mulk, Gulf country. Today or tomorrow they could kick us, us meaning Baluch, out. So when you go to Iran, where will you sleep? In the streets? It's necessary for one to have a house, she says, even if one is not working there. We need to have a house there. So they constantly refer to the negative experiences of Baluch in other Gulf countries, especially those in the UAE with whom Baluch people in Qatar are most connected to. So this acts as an important reminder for people, since they consider it to be a likely outcome for them. So Baluch's financial and relatedly emotional investment in Iran is an example of reactive transnationalism. So Nur Muhammad said that he is actually new to Iran, but recently, due to his investments in building houses, he is in frequent contact with his relatives. He said, "I have more connections with Hussein, his relative, who handles my investments in Iran. He's like the manager of everything. I have connections with him daily, and every day I talk to him. He has everything in his hand, my bank account, my house, my lands. He would tell me if there is a good land for me to buy. He sends me the pictures of property and goes and buys them." So the practice of having a house in Iran has also become an important medium through which Baluch residents maintain transnational ties. Marta Erdal considers migrant houses as relational places located in transnational social spaces. Houses as relational spaces are significant for social relations between families and individuals located across transnational social fields. So, as I said, Hussein as well takes care of his property and is also benefiting financially as well, since Nur Muhammad offers him financial compensation. But most importantly, to legally recognize this relationship between Hussein and Nur Muhammad, both had to sign a vakalatname, power of attorney document, as shown in this picture. So this document gives Hussein the power to act on behalf of Nur Muhammad and make legal decisions, especially those related to property management and buying, as well as conducting any bureaucratic work, such as visiting government offices to get land and land approvals and documentations. So in the absence of Nur Muhammad, his family is also benefiting from the houses that exist there, and they use it as additional accommodation. So Nur investing in property is also socially expected of him as a man. So people say, this is in his own word, people say it's aib, shame, that you are here in Qatar and you do not have a house in Iran. You do not have a land. It's aib. People will mock you that you are showing off, but you have no land. I heard people saying, Tipi haste, balilua. He has the looks, but not the house. So now that I have everything, I am liked. So Baluch in Qatar who built houses in Iran are also showcasing their wealth in order to obtain social status. Often those who reside in Qatar are also stereotyped as rich and have lots of money to invest or to send to their relatives as remittances. So a lot of Baluch started buying houses, especially when there was a devaluation of Iranian currency. So the economic condition in Iran also helped these families who come from low socioeconomic status to buy land or invest in property. So within the Baluch community, building houses, as I said, is a mainly men's affair, as they're encouraged more by their families and society to build houses. So when Guluk, one of my interviewees, discussed the houses her family owns, owners among her relatives were mainly men. Mainly her sons. Guluk herself has a house, however it was bought and is owned by her husband. She stated that all her sons have houses in Iran. Zainab also informed me that women only recently started buying houses in Iran. However, she observed, quote, men have more houses in Iran. The men who have houses are married men, and they know that tomorrow when their children get older, they would need a place to sleep. Those who are not married have nothing. End of quotation. So in the Baluch community, men are assigned the role of the breadwinner. They're responsible for meeting the financial needs of family members, including wife and children, and for providing them with housing and accommodation. The patrilocal marriage arrangements among Baluch also This encourages women from owning houses since they have to move to the residence of the husband's family. Baluch men also inherit land owned by their fathers through patrilineal inheritance in order for the property to remain within the family, while daughters, whether married outside or within the family, inherit nothing. So as I demonstrated here, not everyone within the community has a land in Iran or affords to do so. Class, gender, social networks, as I've shown, and economic conditions back in Iran play an important role. And just to wrap up this whole this presentation, so as I said, not all Baluch in Qatar are engaged in upholding transnational lives, and not everyone's relations with their families are like that of Nur Muhammad and Hussein. One of the issues discussed by some of my interviewees is strained relation and its impact on their transnational activities. Those with such relations with people in Iran have expressed less interest in engaging in transnational activities, whether physically or through family visits, or long distance through phone calls. Some also highlighted that they're giving more than they are receiving. So this imbalance and unequal relationship between givers and receivers of transnational support creates feelings of resentment rather than closeness and lessens transnational activities. I also found that there were more restrictions on women's transnational mobility, especially those from a younger generation. For instance, they said that they faced harsh criticisms when traveling to Iran alone, both by their family here and those in Iran. Single and young women often cannot travel without being accompanied by a male mahram. So other than these gender dynamics and troubled relations with relatives, feelings of belonging to Qatar also have an impact on whether Baluch want to engage in any transnational activities. So Adil, a Baluch male resident in his 30s, showed a sense of belonging to Qatar and a less desire to invest in property in Iran. He stated, "Why would I build a house in Iran if I know that my life is here in Qatar? Tomorrow, if I build houses and open shops, neither my children nor myself would live in Iran. Why would I build a house for no reason? If I want to build, I will do that in Qatar. I have spent all my life, from my childhood, now adulthood, in Qatar. Why would I live in Iran? I would try to do my best to get the Qatari citizenship and buy a house and build my life here." So this lack of a sense of belonging to Iran, despite having an Iranian citizenship, this demonstrates that Baluch feel a sense of belonging to Qatar, but one that is fragile due to their temporary legal status. So both temporariness and act of buying land does not prevent Baluch from creating a sense of belonging to Qatar. Lastly, I'll just end this by this one quote and then that's it. So one of my interviewees said, "I feel that I am the son of this country. Even though that I'm Iranian, all my life has been in Qatar. I go to Iran for a month and feel that I should return to Qatar as soon as possible. I cannot be without Qatar. I have friends here. I know its streets, people, and all the country. I know it all. Thank you so much."
Thank you. شكرا جزيلا للزميلة حميدة دورزادي على مشاركتنا بحث ميداني قيم سلط الضوء على عدد من الخصائص المجتمع البلوشي في قطر. ومعنا للتعقيب على هذا العرض معنا الدكتور مهران كامرافا، مدير وحدة الدراسات الإيرانية في المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات، وهو أستاذ في جامعة جورج تاون قطر. نشر العديد من الأوراق والدراسات المحكمة وعددا من الكتب، بما في ذلك كتابيه الصادرين حديثا تاريخ موجز للثورة الذي صدر في سنة 2020، وكتاب بعنوان داخل الدولة العربية الذي صدر في عام 2018. Let me introduce you also in English. Dr. Mehran Kamrava. He's here to comment on this presentation. He's the head of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Policy Studies and Research. He's also professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. Dr. Kamrava is the author of a number of journal articles and books, including most recently A Concise History of Revolution and another book, Inside the Arab State. Welcome, Dr. Kamrava, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I apologize for giving in English. I don't think you'd want to listen to my very sparse Arabic. Congratulations, Hamideh. I think now it's obvious to everyone the caliber of your scholarship. I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation and I learned a great deal. This is a presentation, this is a discussion, a paper that is rich in empirical data, as we saw. And it also has a very robust theoretical framework in which it engages with the literature on migration and the various and facets and the phases that are involved in the migration process, from the very start of when a decision is made to migrate to the actual process of moving, and then the process of assimilation and unending precarity that's involved, the precariousness and the sense of temporariness and not quite belonging. And what is really revealing was the very final quotation that we heard, which is, because of the migratory process, you really don't belong anywhere. You don't belong in the country with which you have official documents, but at the same time, you don't quite necessarily belong, at least officially, in the country in which you live, the country that you have adopted. And so I think what we see here is a really terrific discussion of the dilemmas and some of the problems that are involved in the migratory process. I think Hamideh is to be commended for the work that she has done in some ways of political anthropology. Political scientists like me often like to think in big, grand terms. We talk about dynamics of how states operate, and we talk about policy making. What we seldom engage in is the kind of thick description that we just heard. And I think that in that sense, Hamideh is to be commended. The contributions that at least I gleaned from this paper can really be categorized into three distinct but related categories. First and foremost, Hamideh highlights the migratory process of a community which, as she mentioned, has not really been studied. We know that the whole phenomenon of migration to the Arabian Peninsula has really been studied since after 2010. If you look at the literature, at least that is available in English, you really don't have robust discussions and academically grounded discussions of migration and the processes involved in the migration of labor prior to 2010. And there's a book that came out in 2012, looked at some of these issues. But the work that existed early on focused primarily on the United Arab Emirates. And only recently, the work of anthropologists like Andrew Gardner have highlighted the migration of labor in Qatar and examination of Qatari labor. I have a colleague at Georgetown, Zahra Baber, who's done significant work. There was a colleague at Qatar University who did excellent work. He has since left for England and is now working on in England, but still works on the same topic. But really, the different communities in Qatar have not been studied. And I think the significance of this work is that it sheds light on a community that is not really, hasn't been studied by the scholarship. A second significant area, which I think we all benefit from, and an area in which much of the existing literature is guilty of, is the fact that Hamideh's work writes women back into history and focuses on one significant segment of the population that has historically been overlooked in the migratory process. Much of course, migration has been by male laborers. We know, for example, that in Qatar, numerically, there are 3 times as many men as there are women. And so it would be natural for those who study migration to study male migrants. At Georgetown, a few years ago, I was involved in a study of migrant labor's access to health. And immediately within the first couple of weeks, we realized that we couldn't study women. We had to focus on men because much of the migrant women that are here tend to work in private homes to which we didn't have access, whereas we did have access to construction sites. So the subject lends itself to focus on male migrants, and in that sense, again, I think this study fills an important gap in our study and our understanding of migrant workers. And a third significant contribution that Hamideh offers is the empirical dilemmas, the day-to-day, the routine difficulties that are involved as migrants, all migrants, navigate their immediate future. Do I stay? Do I go? Does my RP get renewed? What happens when I retire? How do I navigate staying here? How do I navigate this precarity? And what studies of migration, existing studies of migration, seldom look at is the fact that for many migrants, going back home is not an option. And we, particularly for those who are semi-skilled and skilled, for the middle-class migrants, going back home usually is not an option. It's very difficult or impossible, if not impossible. And one of the things that Hamideh's work does is to bring this out in relation to the Baluch community, which is an ethnic minority in Iran. It is a community which in Iran lives in a very deprived area, in an area that is economically underdeveloped. And so it is really interesting that, again, Hamideh highlights an area of study of migration that existing studies have historically overlooked. So I very much enjoyed it, Hamideh. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamrava, for your comment. It's very rich. We can now open the floor to your interaction. Okay. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure.
شكرا.
Thank you, Hamideh, for this presentation. And thank you, Dr. Kamrava. And I just want to ask you to elaborate somehow on what happened in terms of their legal status after the Baluchis came to Qatar, because as you came without official papers and then they just stayed, and then how did they acquire their official papers that let them stay in the country? And also I may ask you to elaborate on the conditions, because as Dr. Kamrava said, that they came from somehow deprived communities back there in Iran. So if you may also elaborate on the conditions that led them come to Qatar, that's one question. And also I want to say, were the Baluchis aware that they are performing a normal wave of migration? Are they coming to work here in Qatar, or are they coming to come here and stay and just permanently remain here? So this is one more question. And are they also aware of the complexities entailing their wish and interest to acquire a citizenship here in Qatar? Because somehow this is kind of sensitive issue here when it comes to citizenship, because it would also apply to other communities who have been living here in Qatar since the 60s or 70s, let's say. So are they aware of this? And I also want to ask about the identity and belonging issue. You have not spoken about the dilemma of integrating in the society, and you have not highlighted this in the seminar. So I want to ask whether Baluchis are aware of the differences between their identities and their various identities as a bloc. And are you dealing with them as a bloc in the first place? Because I think there are various Baluchis here in Qatar, and the Baluchis who came in the 60s and 70s are different than the Baluchis who came in the 2000s, let's say. So how do they feel towards each other? And that's what I want to ask. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's several questions, very interesting questions to start with. Adeni, yes, second.
اتكلم عربي ولا انجليزي؟
اتكلم عربي وانجليزي.
خلينا بالعربي، الانجليزي بتاعي سيء شوي. شكرا حميدة على هذا العرض، بصراحة يعني بيفتح كتير من الأسئلة. بس عايز أسألك عن مسألة الجزء اللي بيخص الصراع الطبقي وانعكاساته على الجماعات المهاجرة في بلد الأصل أو بلد إيران. في صراع طبقي واضح. البلوش هم في أدنى السلم الاجتماعي، وزي ما قال الدكتور كامرافا بيعانوا من التهميش، والمنطقة بتاعت الجزء البلوشي في جنوب إيران هو ربما هو أكثر مناطق فقرا في إيران كلها. ف يعني محتاج أشوف إذا كان في بلد المهجر حصل هذا الانعكاس الصراع الطبقي أو ما يشبه الصراع الطبقي في إيران، انعكس على الحال في حال البلوش في قطر، بالذات انه في اعلى السلم الاجتماعي في قطر في ايرانيين يعني من اصول ايرانيه، في الفيري ريتش، وزي ما شفنا في الصور الفيري بور برضو فيهم من اصول ايرانيه. فهل حصل هذا على ترانزناشنال ليفل حصل هذا الانعكاس؟ الشيء الثاني يمكن على الجانب الثيوريتيكال النظري، انت هل الترانزناشناليزم كمصطلح بتستخدميه، هل قريبتيه بالمصطلحات اللي موجودة في دراسات الدياسبورا؟ دراسات الدياسبورا لها تاريخ طويل جدا، مصطلح زي الاسيميليشن، مصطلح الجيتويزيشن، ويعني قد تكون مفيدة بالذات ان هي بتشتغل على مجال الكالتشر اناليسيز والتحليل الثقافي، واللي بيدرس بشكل كبير قدرات الاندماج عند الجامعات المهاجرة جوه مجتمع المهجر. شكرا لك.
شكرا لك. في أسئلة أخرى؟ دكتور حيدر.
شكرا دكتور عائشة، وشكرا حميدة على هذا العرض الثري والقيم حقيقة. وأنا يعني مباشرة أدعوها إلى تقديم الورقة إلى دورية عمران حتى تقرأ. يعني أنا عندي ملاحظات، لأن أعتقد يعني النقاش يفتح بعض النقاش النظري. يعني اولا انا يعني كنت مهتم، وللاسف يعني انا شخصيا غير مطلع حول، لا ادري ان كان يجوز ان نستعمل تعبير الامه البلوشيه او على الاقل البلوش ethnicity. يعني اذا كان الفرق بين الاثنيسيتي والنيشن هي فكره انه هاي الجماعه يكون عندها طموح لتكوين دوله، فانا يهمني اولا، وراح اجي ليش هذا مهم، يعني مش بس تاريخ بالنسبه لي، انه هاي اللي مره ثانيه الاثنيسيتي او امه اللي موزعة بين بلدان عدة، باكستان وأفغانستان وإيران، خليكي من الهجرات، كيف كان علاقتها أولا ببلدانها؟ وهل صار في يوم ما طموح لأن يكون وضع مستقل، وضع سياسي؟ كما الحالة الكردية. ليش أقول الحالة الكردية؟ لأن الحالة الكردية من وقت مبكر يعني هي أيضا اثنيسيتي موزعة في 4 بلدان على الأقل يعني، وصار عندها من وقت مبكر طموح سياسي. هنا إذا كان هاي يعني كان عندها، خليني أستعمل مصطلح نيشن هود، يعني حالة الأمة إذا جاز أن نترجمها عربي، إذا كان هناك نيشن هود لدى البلوش أو لا، هل هذا راح يتحكم بالمجتمعات؟ يعني إذا نقارن بالحالة الكردية، المجتمعات الكوميونيتيز الكردي المهاجر إلى أمريكا أو أوروبا أو هل هذا الفرق إذا كان في نيشن هود أصلا راح يتحكم بطبيعة هذا المجتمع المهاجر أو لا؟ هاي النقطة الأولى. النقطة الثانية، وأنا هذا أيضا تفكير نظري يعني يهمني، أنا أعتقد يعني أحيانا مو بالضرورة مفاهيم النيشن والناشوناليزم وحتى المواطنة هي قابلة لأن تصف طبيعة علاقة فرد أو كوميونيتي بأرض هو يعيش بها. يعني تيرنر الأنثروبولوجي البريطاني عنده تعبير يسميه كوميونيتاس. كوميونيتاس يشير به إلى كوميونيتي في طور انتقالي. بال2009، وإذا طولت وقفيني دكتور لأن حقيقة أثار عندي كثير من الأفكار عرض قدمتها حميد. بال2009 سوينا ندوة عن المجتمع العراقي في الأردن. صديقة أنثروبولوجية أردنية استعملت هذا التعبير لوصف حالة المجتمع العراقي في الأردن، لأنه فكرة أنه الأردن بلد ترانزيت مسيطر على مخيال العراقيين بالأردن. بس أنا هاي النقطة اللي تهمني أحيانا، وهذا اللي أعتقد لي لازم نتابعه يعني. وكانت عندك إشارات بس أنا أعتقد أتمنى التعمق، يمكن حتى الدكتور مهران أشار هذا الشيء. إحنا بدل ما نشوف كيف هذا المجتمع المهاجر يبني صلاته كمهاجر، أنا برأيي نشتغل على كيف يبني صلته الثابتة داخل هذا المجتمع. يعني أنا مثلا عندي إيمان أنه الآن 130 ألف عراقي في الأردن، جزء كبير منهم اعتبروا الأردن وطنهم، يعني بغض النظر يعني أنه هم مهاجرين أو لا. وتنبني الصلات، جزء هو ما عنده مواطنة، ما يروح ينتخب، لكن أكو مجموعة من التكيفات اللي يسويها بحيث يبدو هو ما مختلف عن كل اللي عايشين هنا بما في ذلك المواطنين. يعني مثلا لو تابعنا موقف المجتمع البلوشي من تنظيم كأس العالم في قطر، هل هذا هو يريد أنه هذا الحدث ينجح حال القطريين؟ إذن هنا إحنا اختلفنا. هو مو بس كوميونيتي، هاي برأيي تصميم أو بناء لحالة ثبات أكثر ما هي حالة temporariness، مثل ما المفهوم اللي حضرتك أنا مو ضد أستاذة حميدة زميلتي العزيزة، لكن أنا أفكر يعني إيش قد نقدر نثير مثل هاي الأسئلة النظرية من خلال هذا العرض. شكرا جزيلا، وآسف أن طلبت مرة أخرى. أنا أحيي حميدة على هذا البحث القيم.
دكتور حيدر لتوسيع نطاق النقاش وإثارة نقاط جد مهمة. سننتقل بسؤال رابع وثم نعود إليك الدكتور محمد المصري.
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much. Touched on many issues. I think it can be applied to different, and this is my point, especially when the people connect to the country that they live in, for example, Qatar or any of the Gulf states, and when they connect to their homeland, and when they are having a perception to their homeland, it might be, different to what it is in reality. And it's interesting because almost every Palestinian who lives in the Gulf states are saying the same thing. And the Palestinians are similar in a way or another, because maybe they will build their own house in Jordan, which is not Palestine, or in Cyprus, or in Syria, or in Lebanon. It depends which country they used to live, or they have, like an extended family connection. And this is related to the legal system that is not allowing the people to immigrate in, or to settle, or to take the nationality in the Gulf states. But and that's what encouraged me, to ask, because Haider brought a wider perspective to deal with this. And even if you want to deal with it, in terms of nationality or citizenship, or because there are some aspects, as Haider rightly mentioned, which the Qataris, the Palestinians, and the Baluchi are, sharing while they are living in Qatar. Which these dimensions, what the number of at the list that could make the Baluchi Qatari or citizen, regardless the legal status. I'm talking about the feelings and the belonging, which you mentioned very much, and you brought a lot of quotes, and it's beautiful, to know this perspective from the Baluchi community. And I think this is a brilliant way to look at it in order to start developing, a new dimensions of the citizens in this world, especially with the connections that we have via the internet and etc. And that's my comment. And by the way, this as an example, because Haider was talking about the Iraqi community in Jordan, I wanted to talk about the Palestinian community in Jordan, which is enjoying, the Jordanian passport and the full Jordanian citizenship, and they have the political rights in theory. I assume that they have, for example, they can run for the election, they can become a prime minister or ministers. Still, for a long period, they didn't feel that they are Jordanians. And they used to say that we are not Jordanians and we are Palestinians, despite the fact that they have the Jordanian nationality. And I don't blame them. I'm not. But that with the things that Haider mentioned, your representation, what Dr. Bahran said, maybe would open our minds to think how we construct, our nationality when we are given the legal citizenship or the nationality, and when we are not, and to which extent there is a differentiation between these. And I want to take the same example that Haider talked about, the World Cup in Qatar, talking about the Palestinians' attitude in Jordan when the Jordanian team was playing, because they kept denying that we are Jordanians, but they are the ones who are celebrating whenever, the Jordanian team is winning in one of the games. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll stop here for our first round. As you can see, your presentation has raised lots of interest. So back to you.
Thank you very much. These were all great feedback and comments. And I think so when it comes to Yara's questions in terms of what happened to their legal status. So some of the Baluch who decided to stay here, right, citizenship through Iran, but at that time there was no embassy, Iranian embassy in here, through Qatar. And then it was posted to them through Kuwait, and then that's how they got their citizenship. That's one thing. But it's not as simple as this, because some had to leave the country because they didn't have any official documentation. So then they were not able to stay in the country. And most importantly, and this is one of the things that I perhaps didn't mention in this presentation, that there are Bidun within the Baluch community at the moment that we're talking about. And I know personally people who do not have any sort of documentation. So their experiences of Qatar obviously differs. And Another thing is, what are the conditions that led them to migrate? As I said, it's a combination of not just economic, as I showed through the stories of women. It's also socio-political, as I indicated through the stories of women and men. So when we make these comparisons, we find different reasons, right? Not necessarily ones that were imposed on the Baluch, like through the literature, but also the ones that came through the narrative of the people, which I think, as I said, so this looking at the Baluch from at this macro level doesn't provide us with the specificities of, you know, these community. And in terms of identity and belonging issues, obviously, a lot of the Baluch, they said that they are, you know, discriminated against. So, like, it's always, you know, an issue, right? And I think that discussion in and of itself, it deserves its own space, right? So here I was focusing on the notion of temporariness, but I think identity, it deserves its own attention. And I think it's a very important question, especially when it comes to the Baluch. And I think to some extent, it also relates to what Dr. Haidar said and also Dr. Muhammad in terms of like, you know, they have lived here for a very long time, but at the same time, like they might have, you know, a sense of belonging. So belonging isn't just formal belonging. It never is, you know, just because you have a Qatari citizenship. So the way that we understand citizenship at its, you know, typical understanding is membership and rights and responsibilities. But when we look at these stories, that's not often the case. And in fact, I theorized citizenship in my study, but here, because I focused on, you know, the notion of temporariness and transnationalism, I left that behind. But at the same time, one of the important contribution I think my study made was, like, I was looking at tiers of citizenship. So I personally, I don't consider the Baluch, you know, as not citizens, right? They themselves, they don't refer to themselves as not citizens. They say we're Qatari. And in theory, when you look at, you know, the theory of citizenship, there are scholars who say there is also the notion of acts of citizenship. So non-citizens performing as citizens through rights claiming. So Baluch, very much evident in the narrative that they do claim that we have the right to citizenship and we have the right to whatever form of permanency that comes, you know, whether it's permanent residency or citizenship, we want that, right? And there's no question on that. And so this act, so when we look at this acts of citizenship, it allows us to look at this notion of, you know, this multiple tiers that exists within the Qatari community itself. So a lot of the conversation that I had with my interviewees as well pretty much indicated, you know, this notion of having a sense of belonging that, as I said, it doesn't have to be, you know, this formal belonging, but also it has to, you know, how do we create sort of, you know, a permanent belonging, even though that our status is temporary. So another question, and I think it's a very important question, is whether this notion of ethnicity and nation, and I think, so in my study, I consider the Baluch as an ethnicity. So, and I'll explain this. So feelings of, you know, whether we want to be an autonomous, you know, like state, as you mentioned, that Baluch was divided between different regions, so Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. But so there was a time, so this was during the Pahlavi, you know, Pahlavi Regan, where they mentioned that around that time there were a lot of insurgencies actually, you know, by the Baluch community themselves, that they wanted to have an autonomous state. But nowadays, when we look at how that changed over time, it was actually crushed, not just by the Pahlavi, but also by the Islamic Republic as well. So when we make this, but at the same time, when we make these comparisons between Baluch in Pakistan and Baluch in Iran, the nationalistic or separatist tendencies are not so evident in the Iranian case. And also, you know, and also it was evident through my interviews as well. So they never talk about this autonomous Baluchistan. They talked about it, Baluchistan, as part of Iran. But, and I agree that, you know, the notion of Baluch in and of itself is contested, right? And when I said Baluch community here, I meant it both ways. So Baluch as this imagined community, but I was referring to Baluch community as, you know, the space that they occupy here within this compound. So they're a community living together. So Baluch as imagined, as Benedict Anderson says, but also Baluch as, you know, living together in terms of their urban space. So last part was about comparisons between different communities. So while I agree, so there are comparisons and differences between each of these communities, and it's important to highlight that. And I highlighted it when I was talking about the Baluch here, Pakistanis in the UAE context, and so on. But I think we have to be careful here because we have to take into account the historical, social, political, and also economic contexts. And also, as I said, so class plays a very much important role, right? So when you look at the context of Baluch here, they live in very much low socioeconomic status, right? So they are somehow between, like some of them, not all of them. So that some of them are, you know, in between, you know, middle class and working class, but most are working class. So that's what makes it different. So within, I think, and also as some of you said, I think it was Yara who mentioned that there might be differences within the Baluch context itself. And I think that's a very important point because as I said, so I'm not trying to sort of homogenize the experiences of the Baluch because I think that's very unrealistic. And I also wanted to mention that I myself, I don't, you know, mean to represent them through this research, and there are different narratives, and one that I left behind was the question of legal status, right? So obviously the experiences of those who do not have any sort of documentation is different from those who actually have some sort of documentation, which is the Iranian citizenship. So that's all for now, but
That's
if there are more questions.
Okay, we're going to continue with Rajid and then
شكرا حميدة على العرض. جزء من الأسئلة أجيب بطبيعة الحال والمداخلات. أنا أول شيء بدي أشكر حميدة على هذا العرض الممتاز إنه سلط الضوء على مجتمع لم نكن نعرف الكثير عنه أو مرئيا يعني على خلاف مثلا المجتمع البلوشي في عمان أو الإمارات أكثر وضوحا وأكثر حضورا. لكن أنا سؤالي نظريا ما الذي يمكن أن نفهمه من خلال حالة المجتمع البلوشي في قطر؟ يعني ما الذي يمكن أن نتعلمه في سياق دراسات الهوية والاندماج والهجرة؟ وأيضا على مستوى الحالة، صحيح أنه أنت لا تحبذين المقارنة كثيرا، لكن ما الذي يجعلنا نهتم بالمجتمع البلوشي في قطر وما الذي يختلف فيه عن المجتمعات البلوشية في البلدان الخليجية الأخرى، ومن جهة أخرى عن المجتمعات الوافدة الأخرى في قطر؟ مثلا الهنود المسلمين في قطر وضعيتهم مشابهة للمجتمع البلوش، المصريين، الفلسطينيين أيضا. وأود الإشارة أيضا إلى مفهوم السوشيال نتورك، الشبكة الاجتماعية، أنه يمكن أن يفسر لنا إضافة إلى المفاهيم الأخرى الحالة التي هم فيها المجتمع البلوشي. كيف بدأت سلاسل الهجرة، كيف بني المجتمع أصلا في قطر، ولماذا وكيف تشكل الحي الذي درستيه في أبو غامور. يعني هل أعيد إنتاج نمط السكن الذي كان في إيران؟ يعني كيف أثر التاريخ الاجتماعي والاقتصادي للمجتمع البلوشي في إيران على واقعهم في قطر؟ لماذا لم تحسن وضعيتهم؟ يعني هل يعني هذا الرابط بالشبكة الاجتماعية والتاريخ الاجتماعي والاقتصادي في إيران وأثره في حياتهم الآن في قطر؟ يعني ربما طلعت على كتاب شفيق الغبرة النكبة وانشاء شتات فلسطين في الكويت. يعني أعتقد أنه كمنهجية وكإطار للعمل ربما يساعد كثيرا في فهم أي مجتمع في الخليج، خاصة أنه ركز مثلا عند الفلسطينيين في نمط السكن، كيف الفلسطينيين أعادوا إنتاج نمط السكن للقرى في الكويت، حتى سموا العمارات بأسماء المدن والقرى، وكيف شكلوا صندوق لمساعدة الأهل مثلا في فلسطين أو في بلدان الشتات الأخرى.
شكرا. السؤال وبعدين ننتقل. اوكي تفضل.
Okay, thank you for such a fascinating presentations. I want to ask, actually, following Dr. Haider's comments on nationhood, what about like nations before nationalism, like written by John? I think it's really important to study the evolution of the ethnic identity and whether there is a possibility of that this evolution the evolutionary concept of ethnicity, especially when it kind of lives in a way of a more of a stable environment, like such as Qatar. Another question is, how do you relate the concept, or how the respondents answer the questions about their identity or their belongingness? There is a process of socialization, I think, in Qatar, and there is a kind of double marginalization that where their homeland, whether which is in Iran, and here there is this process of marginalization or exclusion, and how such process or reinforced and entrenched process of exclusion kind of interact with their sense of belonging and identity. So one last thing about gender, which is really important, and you highlighted in your research, but I think there is something that's missed, which is the having a robust theoretical framework when it comes to gender. So I think you don't have that. It's a limited scope, so you cannot cover everything. But I would recommend Nira Yuval Daves, which she talked about transversal feminism and transnational relations when it comes to the role of women when they are in a different societies or communities. One last point is agency and the agency of the Baluchi communities. How do you think they are kind of processing or dealing or working on their interactions with the home community or with Qataris? So, and I think here it's really important to study the cultural productions from below, because of course they are not legally represented. One last thing is that your positionality. You mentioned briefly at the beginning of the presentation that you were there or you lived there. So yeah, small points about your positionality and when you did the analysis. Thank you very much.
شكرا. آخر تفضلي.
Thank you so much, Hamideh. I learned so much from your talk. These are comments. Feel free to ignore and or pick them up in the discussion. I think
Keep them short, please.
Yes, I will. I largely agree with people's comments regarding belonging. I have a concern about romanticizing these notions of belonging that are centering at the level of affect and thinking more concretely about the materiality of belonging. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the necessity for citizenship. The reality is that we live in a world that is constructed through citizenship. So what does citizenship mean for people from the Baluch community? And the last is just return us again to the urban space. Tell us about the divisions that have been constructed between the community, and tell us about these divisions in pretty much the nitty-gritty, the thick description that was described earlier. Tell us about the gender dynamics. Tell us why folks ended up in communities that basically replicate divisions between the Baluch community according to nation state, Iran, Pakistan, and also Afghanistan. Thank you again. That was a great presentation, and I learned a lot from it.
So much. You have about 8 minutes to answer.
Okay, so thank you so much for all of these questions and also comments. So in terms what do we get when we look at the Baluch context in terms of theoretical? So as I show, so when we look at temporariness, I think we have to also understand that temporariness isn't just in terms of their legal status, but also the space itself. So as I show that the space in and of itself, it mentioned over and over time that it is temporary. So it's not just the legal status, but it also the space that the people occupy within the country. Another thing was citizenship, as I said. So the experiences of the Baluch in Qatar, it invites us to look at the notion of citizenship more broadly than actually just narrowing it down based on citizenship. And in terms of the social networks, as I said, not everyone has social networks. So when initially people migrated here, obviously chain migration was important, right? And chain migration wasn't just, as I said, relative, but it also was, beyond that. Your identity as a Baluch had a role to play in chain migration. So when people moved together, right, I think there was a sense of sort of community, right? So that sense of community, it didn't stop when people landed here, but it continued. And it continued with, this, when you look at the space itself, it continued through people actually living together, right, in that space as a community. But also, I don't want to romanticize the notion of community, because obviously differences exist, right? The way we look at, let's say, the way the Baluch look at Brahuis is different than the Brahuis look at the Joskis. So there's all these dynamics, right, that need to be taken into account. And I think what you mentioned, Dana, is very important, right? So it's not just me telling you that these divides exist within the community, but, you know, these are, you know, the way I looked at it, you know, that these divides exist. But over time, these divides have changed, right? And like, not only that people started living, you know, across, you know, this space, not just, you know, not everyone was designated, okay, you have to live in this place, others need to live in there. So over time, that changed, and more community members started living in this space, right? So migrant workers, for instance, are another community. So like, all of these people are interacting in one space, right? So it's not just the Baluch, right? And I think, so and as you said, so I don't necessarily have to romanticize it as this is the Baluch community, while in reality, when we see that there are, you know, all these differences, and that differences in terms of, you know, different people that occupy the space that exist within this. And other comments about transnational feminism. And I think it's a very important comment, and also agency. So when you look at transnationalism below, it actually takes into account the agency of the migrant. So the migrant isn't just, you know, like that moving around within, you know, these borders, but there's actually an agency. So the migrant is, you know, they're making all these decisions. So there's all these decisions that need to be taken into account. So where will I go? What are the risks and so on? What are the social networks available for me? And yeah. Important thing that I want to highlight is the notion, positionality. Generally, I think that taking into account positionality within the research production is very important. Yes, I belong to the community, and I interact with them on a daily basis. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that I am an insider. I would also say that I'm outsider as well. Typical what we say, right? But it's not only that, so different dimensions of my identity became useful. So my Baluch identity, it provided me access, as well as building a trust with a community that has not been researched before. That's one thing. Another thing, the outsider component, is that I consider myself privileged, right, in terms of my educational attainment, and also language too. I know English, and none of my other community members know English, right? And when it comes to education, and here I want to touch on, women's role within the community, because I think that's important. So as I said, so women assumed a traditional role, but younger generation, including myself, who is part of this younger generation, started to respond to this, right? So even though like some of us were provided with high school education, but even high school education in and of itself is a privilege that not many people have. So given all of this, it actually impacts the sort of privileges that you have. So as I as a researcher, technically I have most of the privileges that many of my interviewees do. So there is a power relation, but that's why when I presented this presentation, I highlighted the voices of my interviewees rather than letting myself speak, or the literature, which I think it doesn't do benefit to the people. So yeah.
جزيلا لهذا العرض القيم ولطرح عدد من الأسئلة وتعريف بمجتمع حقيقة غير معروف يعني شروع في دراسة ميدانية جد جد قيمة. نشكركم، نشكر الحضور الكرام، نشكر المتابعين عبر وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي، ونضرب لكم موعدا في الأسبوع المقبل أظن لحلقة نقاشية جديدة من برنامج سيمينار المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات. شكرا جزيلا.